Importation of the BMW saloons and sports cars started in earnest in 1935. They were much better than their British equivalents, and they attracted a lot of attention, especially because, once again, the owners who bought Frazer Nashes started buying these BMWs and used them in competition. The owners, the Frazer Nash buyers, in fact, stopped buying chain-drive cars. They were so impressed by these BMWs, and chain-drive cars very quickly dwindled away. By end of 1936, production of chain-drive cars had virtually stopped. However, these saloons were expensive. They were well built, and with the import duties, it made the cars very expensive in Britain. So therefore, they were a better car if you could afford it. Therefore, some of them were more difficult to sell. The sports cars were popular because they were sports cars, and there was nothing else that could compete with them, really. But the saloon cars, it was difficult. So Aldi was looking around to build them in Britain and avoid the import duties. He had long discussions with the Riley company, and that might have come to something, but Riley themselves were having financial problems, and it ended up not coming to anything. Still, Aldington managed to sell, on average, 100 of these cars a year, which is a lot more than he had been selling his Frazer Nashes, and not a bad number for that time during that time. But the real high point was the 328. When BMW introduced their 328, very elegant car. In 1936 it came out. There's HJ once again competing at Brooklands. It used again this same lightweight tubular chassis which had been introduced back in 1933, together with a larger and more powerful version of the six-cylinder engine. Again, it dominated the 2-litre class in Europe. It was certainly one of the most important sports cars of the 1930s. Over 40, Mark said I think 46 of these 328s were imported into Britain from 36 until 39. So again, a successful car. Not cheap, quite an expensive car, but very successful at what it did. But then the war came in 1939. It all came to a crashing end. Obviously, the war proved a complete disaster for BMW. Being an aero engine manufacturer, they got back into aero engine. Through the 1930s, they were producing cars, motorbikes, and aero engines again. And towards the end of the 30s, they were building for the Luftwaffe. Obviously, they were told to do so. They had to do it. And therefore, the Allies came along and bombed the hell out of them. So by the end of the war, or even just before, a lot of their facilities had been reduced to rubble. The Russians, after the war, the Russians claimed the eastern plants, and the Americans claimed the Bavarian plants. H.J. Aldington and his older brother Bill visited Munich in 1945 to see the state of affairs there and meet their friends and business partners at BMW. And what they found was utter devastation. But the BMW directors were very helpful, those who weren't actually in prison at the time, to be checked out by the Americans. And after H.J. went back for a second visit later in the year, they were given loads of drawings, all the drawings that had survived the war, and experimental engines, and in some ways, most importantly, this car, which is a BMW 328 chassis and engine with a special lightweight streamlined body. It competed in the 1940 Mille Miglia, and again, they did very, very well there. And H.J. was able to bring one of these home, pretending it was his own personal car, and that proved to be the basis for the new post-war Frazer Nash. So still the connection, Frazer Nash and BMW continues. But Frazer Nash weren't in a position to go into production, and they passed all these drawings and the experimental engines, everything except that car, that previous car, over to the Bristol Aeroplane Company. Bristol Aeroplane Company had never produced a car before, but they had lots of very skilled workers, and they needed to do something after the war. So they decided to get into cars, and they built the Bristol 400 saloon, which came out in 1947 and was, to all intents and purposes, a BMW built in Britain. Back in Germany, BMW struggled to their feet, and although they weren't, again, allowed to get into aviation, although there wasn't much aviation going on then, they were able to get back into motorcycles. and that started from 1948. Before that, they were making pots and pans and bicycles from scrap aluminium from aero engines, etc. So they had to really drag themselves up all over again. 48, they got into motorbikes, and around the same time, Fritz Fiedler, the man on the left, there with H.J. Aldington, to us, a very famous man, very, very capable man. He was the one that designed the tubular chassis. From 1936 onwards, he's been responsible for the designs of all of the cars, or he was the design chief. He had very good people working for him. So he was responsible for the 328. He knew his stuff, in other words. And he was kicking his heels back in Germany. And HJ said, why don't you come and join us over at Frazer Nash and help us develop a new sports car? So this required it had to be approved by the British authorities. So under war reparations, Fiedler joined Frazer Nash in 1947. He had a very kindly nature, apparently, and obviously a very thorough engineering knowledge. This meant that the English workers who just fought a war against Germany again, nonetheless accepted this man because he was a very good individual, and he was very popular in the Frazer Nash works. So here's the new Frazer Nash chassis, which was developed, not actually designed by Fiedler, but developed by him. Again, an A-frame chassis, somewhat different to the one that BMW had used in the 30s, but the same suspension as BMW, front and back, and the same engine. So basically an English BMW 328 with a bigger and stronger chassis. Fiedler was an expert on the engine side as well, and was responsible for tuning the 328 engine and getting more and more performance out of it. The new Frazer Nash was launched in 1948 and immediately proved successful in motorsport, which admittedly was slow off the ground with all the destroyed roads and lack of money at the time. HJ got back into competition. 49 was his last year, in fact. How old was he? Well, he was about 50, I should think. And one of the things he did was enter both a Frazer Nash sports car and a Bristol saloon in the Targa Florio down in Sicily. For that race, it went round the coastal roads. Later on, it went through the mountains, but it was round the mountain roads were all destroyed, so it was round the tough coastal roads of Sicily. And he drove, together with Count Lorani, this BMW, whereas Dorino Serafini, who was an Italian motorcyclist who was 1939 world champion on motorcycles, he drove the Frazer Nash. And Serafini and the Frazer Nash led the whole field, including mostly Italian sports cars, for more than half the distance in the new Frazer Nash, its first competition outing. But unfortunately, the roads were very wet and treacherous, and he eventually skidded off the road and had to retire. But Aldington and Lorani carried on in the BMW and finished second in the touring car class.
Bristol actually...
Sorry, what did I say? Well, almost the same thing, Ken. I wouldn't say that to the Bristol club. The other race where HJ competed, he competed in the Alpine Rally as well that year, but also at Le Mans. And here he is looking very dirty with a bottle of water and glasses on there and a jumper. And he's just finished third, together with the owner of the car in the white overalls. They finished third behind a Ferrari and a Delage, I think. And because they'd done so well, the car outside, if you've seen the exhibition, is called a Le Mans replica. It's not a replica, it's real. It's made by Frazer Nash. But it gets its name as it's a replica of this car that finished third. Frazer Nash used that name. They used it pre-war too with the Tourist Trophy replica. And other companies, Aston Martin, maybe Bentley, it was something you did in those days. Replica meant the works had made it, it was the same. It's not the same as we say now, where it's not quite the same thing. 2 years later, in 51, Frazer Nash had probably its greatest success. Frazer Nash competed in the Targa Florio in Sicily, in the mountains now, in 50, 51, 52 and 53, and each year with Cortese, a Grand Prix driver for Ferrari in his time, so a top driver, and he beat all the Italian cars to win the 1951 Targa Florio, the only British car manufacturer ever to do that. And every 10 years now we go and visit Sicily to commemorate this major occasion. We've been twice and it's a lovely island. Same year, 1951, the Alpine Rally. We regularly go to the Alps in our old Frazer Nashes to celebrate victories there back in the 1930s. But also in 51, terrible roads in those days, still from not really repaired after the war. So again, Frazer Nashes were very successful in Alpine trials with this BMW 328 Le Mans replica. And they won Alpine Cups in 51, 53 and 54. Just as good as the chain drive cars, in other words. And then lots of future Grand Prix stars started out their careers at an early age, both in BMW 328s and Frazer Nashes. Sterling Moss had a 328. He was then entered twice, or 3 times in fact, in Le Mans replicas. Here he's just won the 1951. He had hair in those days, you notice. 1951 British Empire Trophy. This car is outside. We own it at the archives. He competed there in 51 and 52 in that same car. He also competed at Monaco in 52. But other future Grand Prix winners who drove Frazer Nashes early on were Mike Hawthorne, first British world champion, English indeed, and Tony Brooks, plus Salvadori and various others, Tony Crook, but the 3 famous ones were Moss, Hawthorne and Brooks. What were BMW doing? Well, after 3 years working for Frazer Nash, Fritz Fiedler got fed up with austerity Britain, I expect, and returned to austerity Germany and developed the new BMW Saloon, which was introduced in 52. And Frazer Nash felt obliged to import it because their relationship with BMW was ongoing. And they did import a few of these cars into Britain. Very difficult to sell, not sporting, not really what the typical Frazer Nash customer would want. Nonetheless, this photograph shows the 1955 London Motor Show. Frazer Nash did exhibit BMWs right through to 1958. Here we got some more sporting ones, beautiful 507 there, 503 behind. Very expensive. Again, didn't sell many, but they kept faith with BMW through the 50s. The Nash at the back is nothing to do with Frazer Nash. It's the American Nash over there, so I don't know what the organisers were thinking when they did that. The relationship between Frazer Nash and BMW folded in 1959. Frazer Nash was supposed to have a stand for them in the 59 Motor Show, but they fell out over the BMW 700, super little car, which wasn't given to Frazer Nash. So H.J. Aldington went off in a huff, and the relationship came to an end. But to be fair, his relationships with all the big boys of the 1930s who ran BMW, they had, including Fiedler, who'd become chairman for a little while, they had all retired from BMW. They weren't really there. The relationship was with a new generation of BMW directors. And the Aldington BMW good feeling had gone away. So that is the end of the story about how Frazer Nash and BMW surprisingly came together.